The BRICS Summit 2018 is underway in Johannesburg. As trade battles threaten to blaze across the world, how can BRICS countries band together to embrace free trade? And U.S. President Donald Trump is opening yet another front in the ongoing U.S.-China trade war, this time blaming China for launching a currency war by weakening its yuan. What's behind these latest claims, and how will a drop in the yuan's value impact trade tensions? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Liu Xin. But first, my take on President Xi's speech in Johannesburg on Wednesday. Imagine the world is a big classroom with different tiers of students. Some students have been doing very well, like developed countries, led by a tall big buddy called the United States. The other tier, made up of developing countries, is led by China. Within this tier, there are a few who have made remarkable progress and bonded together more closely. Let's say they are the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now they're meeting in Johannesburg together with their friends and neighbors who are all trying to catch up. For some time now, the relationship between the two tiers has been strenuous. In President Xi's words, changes unseen in a century are unfolding. The relationship between the two leading students of the two tiers, namely the US and China, has been particularly challenged. Feeling threatened, the big buddy accused the newcomer of cheating and is getting physical. The classroom's big buddy has become a big bully. Tension is in the air. So how to react? The newcomer has his views and suggestions, and President Xi laid them out on Wednesday in Johannesburg. To his fellow BRICS peers, President Xi called for unity. When the big buddy wants to protect at all costs his relative advantage, the rest of the students must make sure the classroom stays open for learning, the exchanges of ideas, and growth. Unless more exchanges such as trade and investments are facilitated, the gap of performance will grow wide. There are new ways to catch up faster, President Xi said, boosted by new technologies and innovation. He suggested BRICS countries must catch that wave and leapfrog. They should do a better job at home and make themselves better innovators. He cautioned, facing the new wave, those who don't catch the tide will be left behind. He also hinted to the first-tier students who see innovation as their monopoly. In the face of new opportunities brought by new technologies, every student has an equal right to development. More technological exchanges should be organized so that everybody can give it a shot. To friends and neighbors of BRICS, President Xi pledged to help them fully participate in school activities and division of labor so that they can do better. China's efforts to help African counterparts should be a model for students in need to helping one another. President Xi received a warm round of applause for this. To the first-tier students, President Xi also had some explicit messages, which he has repeated on many occasions but can never stress enough. Although the current order of things in the classroom is not ideal, it is not useless. China and its peers have thrived under this exact system. What they are seeking are some equal rights in the management of classroom affairs, and their views are consulted and their say proportional. As to the big tall buddy who has been tearing up the rule book and acting just as he wishes, President Xi gave a warning. Don't do that. We will get all hurt because I will be forced to protect myself by striking back. By the way, the first-tier students are not just sitting idle. You've probably heard the EU and Japan have reached a free trade agreement and that a potential deal is being struck between the EU and the United States to abolish their mutual tariffs. Whether or not the deal can be pulled off, the heat is on. President Xi's call for BRICS and their friends and neighbors to huddle closer could not have been more timely, as winter could be coming for everyone. Now let's start our discussions, and leaders from 5 BRICS countries started their 10th summit in Johannesburg, South Africa on Wednesday, the first such summit since US President Donald Trump's administration triggered trade tensions around the world in a push to rebalance trade multilateralism that President Trump has declared unfair. Facing challenges of trade protectionism, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa have gained a fresh impetus to enhance trade cooperation, and their leaders have found a collective voice in championing global trade. In his speech on Wednesday, as I mentioned, Chinese President Xi Jinping reiterated China's embrace of free trade, openness and the multilateral system. He said a global trade war should be rejected because there will be no winner. He also urged the trade bloc to take advantage of opportunities offered by the fourth industrial revolution, a new type of partnership among BRICS countries. So what's special about the cooperation based on the new industrial revolution, and how should the BRICS band together to fight against unilateralism and trade protectionism? For more, I'm joined from Johannesburg by Professor Patrick Bond from the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand. And here in the Beijing studio, Professor Wenping, Senior Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to both of you. Let me go to Professor Bond in Johannesburg first. Now, the theme of this year's BRICS Summit is BRICS in Africa, collaboration for inclusive growth and shared prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. Why is the fourth industrial revolution emphasized at this year's summit?
Well, this is one of the most controversial questions because in reality we've been seeing some negative aspects like mass unemployment. The banking sector had some robots replacing workers. It created a storm. We've also had some bad experiences with artificial intelligence, with hacking recently of one of the major insurance companies. There's a fear of cryptocurrencies as a way to engage in illicit financial flows. So in a way this is a chance for the BRICS leaders not just to promote the virtues of high technology, but to protect the citizenries against the excessives, including excessive surveillance. And I think that's the danger, is that one of the key people who runs the BRICS Business Council, his name's Iqbal Survey, he tried to promote a fourth industrial revolution company, Sagarmatha, and the big business guys here chopped him, and they wouldn't let him list his company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange just a few weeks ago. So this is a very crucial time to either make or break the, let me call it the sort of goodwill of the fourth industrial revolution, when we know there's a lot of dangers if it's not regulated.
Now, in his speech, Xi Jinping advocated a new type of partnership among BRICS countries. Let's take a listen to the soundbite.
Partnership on the new industrial revolution, which involves more coordination of macroeconomic policies, closer cooperation on innovation and industrialization, and joint efforts to accelerate economic upgrading and the replacement of growth drivers.
So, Professor Wenping here in the Beijing studio, why are these areas considered essential for the BRICS to work on?
Well, we all know that the 5 BRICS members, they are coming from different parts of the world and also have different competitive advantage among their industries. For example, like India is very good about those like IT industry and software industry and innovation. And like China, we are very good about those manufacturing industry and also now catch up to those high level of manufacturing industry. And from the perspective of Russia, they are also very good about those heavy industry and resources industry. And also South Africa, they are the leading industry country in the continent, in the African continent, and also very good about some innovative industry as well. So all of those different competitive advantage now needs to be coordinated. And when they are also hands-in with Africa to push Africans' industrialization, so different countries can share different those advantages and also show the coordinated rather than competitive with each other, like in the different country of the African continent. So this is number one. Number 2 point is this replacement of those drivers, economic drivers. We all know in China before, in the past like 40 years reform and opening up, our economic drivers are normally coming from those trade and investment. But now we need to switch from those traditional trade and also investment, goes to those high technical know-how, use those innovative those engines as the new drivers for our economic growth. For other, I think, emerging BRICS countries, they are facing the same thing. So different replacement either. So I think that those replacement also can give, release a new room for those economic growth, especially for those latecomers like from Africa.
Yeah. Professor Bond in Johannesburg, now data from the World Bank shows that even before President Trump proposed his trade tariffs, there were declining trends in world trade and GDP growth, including in all the BRICS countries. So what was behind these declines, and what challenges have these trends brought to BRICS cooperation at this moment?
Yes, that's exactly right. There's even a word being used, deglobalization, and I feel that when China did two things, Beijing put on controls on finance in January 2016, put on controls particularly on investment because the stock market had crashed. So it taught us that sometimes these financiers can be out of control. Secondly, this week, the Chinese government was able to promote more inward-oriented growth. I think those are the two crucial lessons, that even though there's rhetoric about free trade and avoiding protectionism, it's those concrete strategies that we should be learning from Beijing. And that means dealing with the deglobalization trends that come from excessive overreach, or for example in China's case, excessive capacity, very high levels of excess capacity in steel, in building materials, and these of course then affect the price of commodities that Africa sends to China. They've been going down. They've popped up a little recently. Maybe the Belt and Road will increase them. But I think it means maybe instead of a centripetal world economy tightening as we all spin around, we are seeing some centrifugal, so we're spinning around and falling off. Many African countries now are in a debt crisis. They will find it difficult to pay back Chinese loans or provide profits to Chinese companies and the other BRICS companies as well. And I think that does mean taking advantage of deglobalization, just as my colleague has said, to move to a higher level of technology, yes, but also to make sure that basic needs are met the way the Chinese did in its first post-crisis investment wave.
Right. Well, Professor Wenping here in the studio, basically the debt situation in many African countries have been in the spotlight in many international news outlets. They are talking about the level of debt that China and maybe some other BRIC countries are providing to African countries so high that they won't be able to sustain it, they won't be able to pay it back. What is China's consideration? Is there a worry there to, put some kind of moderation there?
Of course, China being the soft loan provider, we have 10 times more reasons for worry about those debt, because we are the giver. So I think in order to get rid of those debt issue, Africa actually suffered in the past time, because in the past time Africa's debt has been accumulated by those former colonizer and also those international financial institutions. But now, how to get rid of those traps they used to be in? I think the only way out is to make those projects sustainable, because all those infrastructure, like those projects, you cannot say in order to make that very hungry person not died from those overeating, and then you just stop giving them food. So that's not the way out. So the only way out is you also offer the food and then help them to digest those food in a very healthy way. So this thing is to make those projects in a sustainable way. So how to make those projects sustainable? I think one thing we have been doing is to improve those industrialization level in Africa. So make those infrastructure, those like the trains, those railway, like those road and the harbor, they have job to do. They have those flow of the goods, they have the flow of the people. So with those industrialization level being upgraded and being pushed forward, and then those flows will come up. So I think this is one way. Another way is to train the human beings to improve their working skill, and then they can find a job. And then once they can find a job, and then they are moving from here and there, so drive all the economy also forward. So we have to think in a positive way, trying to get rid of those debt like trap, rather than to think those reverse way, saying stop providing those loans.
Okay. I have about 40 seconds maybe. Professor Bond, in the past, the BRICS African cooperation and South-South cooperation usually fall into financial and economic aid to underdeveloped countries by emerging economies. Is that pattern being changed at this moment?
Yes, well, what we just saw the last couple of days is crucial. It's the new lending relationships between the China Development Bank and Escom, and it's being contested. There was even a protest today and another one yesterday against financing that contributes to climate change. And the other crucial thing to end, if President Xi is really strong on fighting corruption, as we are led to believe, there are corrupt relationships. China Development Bank, South China Rail, these have become quite big controversies, and if we can get to a solid infrastructure that meet people's needs without some of those relationships that come through finance and Chinese companies and paybacks and kickbacks to, for example, the Gupta brothers here, very notorious family, then we can really move forward on meeting infrastructure needs, and I hope, just as my colleague says, making enough profit to repay Chinese loans.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. We're running out of time. I do hear a lot of complaints as well from Chinese entrepreneurs who are doing business in Africa. They are, suffering, according to them, on a daily basis of the corruption problem in Africa, and they don't know how to get out of it. I think it's a two-way problem, and it's not. I don't know. I think that takes a much longer time to discuss. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guest from Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond at the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand, and here in Beijing, Professor Wenping, Senior Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, I'll be asking what's behind President Trump's claim that China is starting a currency war, and what does a weakened yuan mean for the trade conflict? Stay with us. U.S. President Donald Trump called China a currency manipulator in his tweet last Friday, triggering suspicions that the trade conflict between the two countries will spiral into a currency war. President Trump's latest provocations came right before the Chinese yuan dipped to a 13-month low of 6.5569 against the U.S. dollar on Wednesday. That's according to the China Foreign Exchange Trade System. Between mid-June to late July, while China and the U.S. ramped up trade threats, the yuan dropped 5% against the U.S. dollar. President Trump says China is intentionally devaluing its currency to cushion the blow of U.S. tariffs. China, however, says no, it's letting market forces guide the exchange rate, which is exactly what the U.S. has been pushing for all along. So what's behind this latest turn in the U.S.-China trade conflict, and how will a weakened yuan exacerbate trade tensions? And now that the U.S. and EU seem to be reaching a trade breakthrough, what can we expect next? Joining me from Boston is Frank Ackerman, a principal economist at Synapse Energy Economics, and here in the Beijing studio, Sitao, chief economist at Deloitte China. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Ackerman, let me come to you first. President Trump, as I said, is accusing China of intentionally devaluing its yuan to offset the impact of U.S. tariffs since China has run out of U.S. goods to tax in retaliation. But China says the yuan's dip is due to market forces. Is there any grain of truth in President Trump's claims, or are his accusations just part of his trademark theatrics and hysterics?
I don't see any evidence for currency manipulation. The exchange rate has returned to about what it was in the first half of last year. In fact, I've seen that in looking at the dollar against many currencies. The dollar looked weaker early this year, and now the exchange rates have returned to about where they were middle to beginning of last year. So I think that the change has been in the value of the dollar, not in the value of the yuan or other currencies around the world, and there's no evidence that it was manipulation.
Mr. Xu, now on Thursday the yuan strengthened to 6.7662 against the US dollar, according to the China Foreign Exchange Trade System. How is the exchange rate determined in China of the yuan, and what factors determine a dip or rise in its value?
Okay, Chinese currency is pegged to a basket currency. Now the weight is now being unveiled. Central Bank or People's Bank of China in recent years has introduced an element, so-called counter-cyclical element. So in layman term, what the central bank is doing is increasing some discretion. So yen is being really being managed by the central bank, but pegged to a basic currency, not against US dollar. In the long run, and the fluctuation of the RMB exchange rate would increase, but in the short term, I think it's just going to be stable.
When asked about President Trump's latest accusations, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang said on Monday the yuan's exchange rate is mainly determined by market supply and demand. It floats in both ways, which means there are ups and downs. So, Mr. Xu, again to you, if the Chinese government isn't pulling the strings behind the scenes, as President Trump's and the world believe, why has the yuan dropped so much?
Well, first of all, I'm not too sure how much, right? So yen has depreciated against dollar by roughly 5% so far this year, along with many currencies, as the other guest in Boston has said. And we need to understand right now interest rates are rising in the United States. And in fact, in several major economies, central banks are tightening. But in China, interest rates are either being held stable. Actually, the central bank wants to inject more liquidity by cutting reserve requirements and so forth. So the interest rate differential between China and the major economies are widening. So that's really waning on the exchange rate. And secondly, right now inflation in China is relatively low. So there's little risk for China just to let exchange rate slide gently against US dollar, mainly because domestic economic considerations.
Mr. Ackerman, the IMF said in 2015 that China's renminbi was no longer undervalued, and despite President Trump's campaign promises to label China a currency manipulator, the U.S. Treasury did not accuse China of manipulating its currency in its semi-annual currency report released in April. Why not, and why does President Trump keep fixating on the same accusations informally but not formally?
Well, I think what we see is that everyone who is thinking about this during the daytime with the lights on has concluded that there's no evidence of manipulation. And we have a president who apparently loves to make announcements by Twitter in the middle of the night. And they do not always agree with what people discover in the daytime with serious research. I think that in 2015 and 2016 there was evidence of currency manipulation in China. It didn't work out very well for the Chinese government. I don't see any evidence that that's repeating, nor does the IMF, nor does most of the U.S. Treasury.
Well, I'm going to continue to quote Trump, if you don't mind, Mr. Ackerman. In an interview earlier this month, President Trump said that a strong U.S. dollar puts us, meaning the United States, at a disadvantage, and that China's currency is dropping like a rock. So explain to us in layman's terms, what's the relationship between the two currencies, and why does it matter in this trade war? Does it?
If a currency goes up or down, eventually that will affect the cost of exports and imports. So if the dollar rises against the yuan or other currencies, then our exports from the United States become more expensive to other countries, whereas imports become cheaper. So that in the long run, this can take 6 to 9 months after the change in the value of the currency for this to fully ripple through the whole world trading system. It also affects financial flows, and the responses to interest rates and the movement of money around the country is a very important part of the picture. That if it looks more profitable to invest in the U.S. because interest rates are rising, or because people have historically believed that U.S. investments were the safest, then money will flow into the U.S. That you have to look at the financial flows as well as the trade flows. Both are affected by exchange rates.
Yeah. Well, at this current rate, Mr. Xu, how much will the yuan's value soften the blow of U.S. tariffs in place, and how low would the yuan have to dip to completely offset the damage from U.S.'s current trade tariffs and threatened tariffs?
First of all, actually, I agree with the other guest in Boston. It's really going to take some time for the exchange rate to be felt in the real economy, and in economics we talk about so-called J-curve effect. So in the short term, I don't think there will be any impact. We need to understand the change of the RMB exchange rate, in my opinion, really not being motivated by tariffs or competitiveness. In China, the main challenge is to reduce domestic debt and corporate leverage. But we cannot cut interest rate because globally everyone is raising interest rate. So adjusting exchange rate is perfectly sound monetary policy. And really 5%, if you look at most currencies, quite often that's just a trading range within a couple of days. So I really don't think we should pay too much attention to this short-term fluctuation of RMB exchange rate.
But again, put this scenario into perspective for us. How big of a deal is it that China's currency is weakening? Is it normal? Is worrisome? Has China seen this happen before, Mr. Xu, and what happened?
Well, a few years ago, actually to be precise, on the 11th of August 2015, China adjusted exchange rate by less than 2%, actually 1.8%, and the financial market was being rattled. And if you look at the reactions from financial market, I actually think the market is taking this in stride, and I don't think we see any change of the sentiment, change of confidence. So it really makes sense for China just to gradually accept the wider exchange rate fluctuation, because in the end, China is very depending on international trade. Trade accounts for 40% economy.
Okay. Finally, Mr. Ackerman, the U.S. and EU announced they reached some kind of a deal on Wednesday that they would like to suspend mutual tariffs. How will this development affect trade relations between the U.S. and China?
I'm not sure how much of a change it will represent. It represents rolling back Trump's threats of trade war with Europe, but trade has been almost free between the U.S. and the EU for many years. The average tariff level is under 3% in both directions. So to say that the U.S. and the EU have reached a new free trade agreement is to say that the previous status quo continues. I don't see it having a big impact. I think that the politics of what the U.S. says about China, and especially what Donald Trump says about China in the middle of the night, has more to do with political fears and strategies and who do they think that they can rile up people by attacking, rather than sober economic analysis.
Okay, thank you very much to my two guests from Boston, Frank Ackerman, Principal Economist at Synapse Energy Economics, and in Beijing, Sitao, Chief Economist at Deloitte China. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.